Hi, thank you for tuning into my channel. Not so long ago, I had an out-of-body experience where I was teaching a class to a group of people who had one thing in common. They were all afraid of dying. Now, please don't think that I'm trying to make myself out to be something special by saying that I was teaching an out-of-body class. We are all very active during sleep hours, whether you recall it or not. Many of us both attend and teach consciousness expanding classes. We also participate in healing and work with our guides in many different capacities that involve being of service. In this particular experience, I was teaching a sort of a workshop to a room full of people, trying to dispel their fear-based conditioning about death. As I looked around the room, I said to them, "Look at yourselves, each and every one of you. You know yourself as this being and this personality and think that it's all there is to you because you believe that you are defined by the body you see in the mirror. But in reality, most of who you are isn't even here in this room." I then asked my students to take out a pen and paper and draw a picture of themselves doing something. Just a simple outline or a stick figure, walking or sitting, something very basic. Now, imagine that this drawing of you is animated and has a basic degree of awareness that is limited to the scene and the piece of paper it's drawn on. What if this two-dimensional cartoon character, representing a crude mock version of you, perceived itself as the primary independent identity, randomly created as a result of chance encounter between pen and paper, or believed that the paper it was depicted on, doing simple activities, was the extent of its existence? What if this stick figure thought that once the acts it was designed to portray were complete and there was no more room left on paper to create additional images, all life ceased to exist beyond the scope and dimension of the flat surface it was confined to? You'd probably laugh the whole thing off as silly and even absurd. You see, this physical version of you in this time and place is the equivalent of that two-dimensional cartoon character projected onto an artificial medium and animated by the multidimensional consciousness of limitless substance and awareness. In reality, you are the infinite, powerful being that conceived the character that you recognize as yourself. And of course, the snapshot that frames the existence of the character it portrays must by definition be finite and limited. But what I want you to understand is that you are not the cartoon. You are the consciousness who creates these cartoons. It was such a great yet simple analogy that when I woke up, I felt inspired to talk about our conditioning and attitudes about death and what comes after, which is why I decided to make this video for you guys. In our society, death is both a mystery and a taboo. We have so much raw emotion tied up in it due to the intense sense of loss it evokes. Today, I want to take you on a spiritual exploration into what it's like for your soul, that is, the self that creates the cartoon which you perceive as your life, what it's like for that being to experience the transition from the physical plane back to its expanded self. To take a peek behind the veil, I must first set up the framework for our discussion by exploring the myths and beliefs surrounding this phenomenon. Culturally, we are so afraid of death that we are willing to go to great lengths to extend life, even if it comes at the cost of great pain and discomfort. Many people choose to suffer and go through what amounts to medical torture, trying to put off the inevitable, rather than enjoying a shorter but arguably more fulfilling remainder of their lives. I find it ironic that as a species, we're so obsessed with duration over quality. We're also conditioned to believe that a human being has no right to decide on how and when they depart this dimension, regardless of the circumstances. We have stringent laws that stop us from exercising what I believe to be our basic right. After all, if we have the right to live, shouldn't we have the right to die with dignity and on our own terms? So euthanasia is another big cultural no-no. Somehow we have enough sense and compassion to humanely put a sick animal out of its misery, but not a person. Clearly, there's a double standard and a disconnect in our values when it comes to death. Why is it logical, kind, and appropriate in some instances, but not others? Now, before I go any further, I want to make it perfectly clear that I in no way, shape, or form promote or endorse suicide. If any of you watching this video are struggling and entertaining thoughts of self-harm, please, please, please seek help. I have posted the suicide prevention hotline number in the description below so that you can call and speak with a counselor to help you get through whatever difficulties you may be facing. My objective here is to explore death as a transition in whatever manner it may occur, which by definition has to include suicide. I think it's important to talk about it in order to understand the implications and the aftermath of such an act, as it relates to our spiritual growth and the impact that it has on the soul. There's also an unfortunate, shameful stigma attached to it, which I would like to try and lift, because it's this ingrained negative connotation that makes it so much harder for the soul to transition after the fact. Much of this, of course, is a result of old-fashioned religious conditioning. Historically, we adopted belief systems and created myths, attempting to explain the greater reality which we can't perceive with our physical senses, yet all intuitively sense. This reality is infinite and not defined by limitations such as space, time, or gravity. So even though we may perceive ourselves as stick figure characters limited to the piece of paper, which we know as our physical world, most people suspect that there's more to us and to life. In this video, I would like to expand the conversation about this fascinating and mysterious topic and question what we know and what we believe. And maybe we can find a kernel of truth somewhere in between. First, I would like to establish the fundamental premise which will serve as the basis and the context for the following discussion. This hypothesis is based on two key assumptions. Number one, there is a greater invisible to us reality beyond our physical perception. And number two, this all-encompassing reality is a product of higher consciousness, which is the organizing principle of all that exists. Personally, I reject the idea of a white bearded man sitting in the sky, judging us and deciding our fate. I think it's natural for us as humans to humanize God, referring to this energy as he or the goddess. But if you really think about it, such definitions are only reflective of our own small-mindedness and limitation. Isn't it more plausible that God isn't a superhuman, but that it is existence itself? Existence which is endowed with self-awareness, purpose, and immense intelligence. And all of us are a part of it. None better or worse, more or less worthy, but simply different variations of complex energy patterns emanating from a singular source. You might say that we can't possibly know what happens after death because we have no way of securing tangible proof of what occurs once the heart stops beating. All we can observe from our physical point of view is that the personality is no longer there. Atheists believe that once you're dead, there's nothing. It's lights out. We simply cease to exist. But this presentation isn't designed to convince non-believers to accept life after death. I'm making this video for those who already accept this reality. The goal here is to give you a perspective on what that reality might be like. This perspective has been shaped by extensive research as well as personal experience. So instead of talking in theoretical platitudes, I want to give you examples and share real stories that molded my understanding. However, please keep in mind that when speaking about death and other similar nebulous concepts, we can only reference what's known as the leading edge relative truth, meaning the best data that's available to us at our present level of development and evolution. It's worth noting that any such data we may gather is unavoidably filtered through our current level of understanding, which could potentially result in distortions of actual reality, at least to some extent. With that being said, there are thousands of documented cases of near-death experiences which show that consciousness remains active long after the body has flatlined. What's even more compelling is that all these unrelated cases seem to have a definite thread of commonality. You may be familiar with cases where people report being either lifted out or sucked out of their body, which they can then observe while floating above it. They're also able to accurately describe people and events not only in the room where their body was at the time of passing, but also in faraway locations when they went to visit their loved ones. This, of course, poses a challenge to the skeptics who claim that the only reason clinically dead individuals recall events in their immediate vicinity is that as long as the brain still has oxygen supply, it continues to record sensory data. Once out of the body, most accounts have people moving toward a great loving light and then going through some sort of life review. Often, these individuals are greeted by departed loved ones and their spirit guides. And then they're given a choice. Do they wish to continue their journey into the afterlife, or do they return to their earthly existence? But you don't have to experience clinical death to get a glimpse into the afterlife. Hypnosis is an excellent tool that gives us an opportunity to access parts of consciousness that are beyond our reach in the normal waking state. If you understand that consciousness isn't a product of the electrical activity in the brain, but that your soul uses the brain to interact with the physical dimension of reality, then you know that who you are extends far beyond your present personality, your body, and this particular incarnation. There are a great many books written by Brian Weiss, Dolores Cannon, and many others detailing such experiences. I myself have induced dozens of people into hypnotic trance and taken them into the other lives that are being experienced by their soul. Personally, I don't particularly care for the term past life regression because it's not an accurate one. In the quantum field, relative past, present, and future all coexist simultaneously and are only separated by frequency. To the soul, all of its lives are concurrent. When regressing a client, I always take them to the end of the particular lifetime we are exploring during the session. Often, though not always, provided that they don't have fearful conditioning surrounding death, clients allow themselves to experience the disembodiment and what happens once they've completed their incarnation. I have had people describe going to a place that they consider to be their true home. Sometimes it's described as a city or a settlement, which includes other beings. In other instances, it's a solitary dwelling in a beautiful place like the beach or something along those lines. And then there are those who describe their home on the other side as majestic dimensions of crystals and light, or even pure energy. But regardless of what it is, they always recognize the place and refer to it as their real home, where they came from before choosing to embark on an incarnation on planet Earth. And their return to this place is always emotional, like a true homecoming. Once they settle back in, they begin to make plans for their next incarnation. Sometimes this involves input of other beings, like guides or a council of some sort. But sometimes the decision is made entirely on their own. What's fascinating is that the future lives they're planning aren't necessarily of a human type. And those, of course, are my personal favorite kinds of sessions. But before I get into the particulars of some of the cases I'm going to share with you, I want to address the potential skeptics watching this video who might say that these accounts are made-up fantasies. And by the way, skepticism is good and healthy, and we shouldn't blindly accept ideas without thoroughly investigating their merits. I personally have been regressed 3 different times, and I myself wondered about the validity of these regressions. That is, until I had my own otherworldly experience. What struck me was that while I was clearly seeing things, I could not identify them. It was the strangest thing. Even though I could describe to some extent the shapes and the colors and textures, I had no idea what I was looking at. Now, it occurred to me that if I was making stuff up, then wouldn't I know what the hell it was I was making up? You see, imagination is referential. When we create a fantasy, we access our existing memory database of concepts that we've already seen and experienced, using them as a reference or a starting point. And then we alter them and combine them into new and different patterns, sort of like Lego pieces. Now, I know I'm repeating myself here, but I want to reiterate that consciousness is not a product of the brain. The brain is simply a computer that records, synthesizes, and organizes the information it perceives. And it does so by converting complex energy patterns into sensory data. This means that when new and unfamiliar ideas, visions, or knowledge enter into our awareness, we are receiving information from the level of consciousness beyond our physical mind. Oftentimes, people in hypnotic trance have no memory of their experience and only learn about it for the first time when listening to the voice recording of their session. When I bring them out of trance, they think that they'd fallen asleep and nothing happened, and then are surprised to find out that they'd been talking for hours. So you're going to have to draw your own conclusions as to the veracity of the following afterlife experiences, which I encountered in my personal hypnosis practice. I had one client who said that after completing the life of a monk on Earth, he took a considerable amount of time to decide where he wanted to go next by observing various realities and planetary systems to find the one that appealed to him the most. He ended up settling on a planet with varied climates and terrains which ranged from arid deserts to humid rainforests. The sky in this world was the color of fuchsia with a very large red sun, which made for short nights and long days. The particular area he was describing had a moderate climate all year round, never too hot or too cold, which was very comfortable for the native inhabitants, who were physical in nature, with tall, elongated bodies and yellow skin. Their facial features were said to be a mixture of feline with something else he couldn't quite describe, with spots on their faces. These tribal creatures had 3 fingers and 2 toes and sustained themselves by eating fruit off the trees. According to the client's description, they wore silky draped clothing processed from some kind of plant material. These beings were also androgynous and reproduced through pure love energy. They communicated by emitting frequencies out of their throats, so there was some sort of a verbal language that they used. This race lived in low structures made of rock. The client said that he was preparing to incarnate into this strange world and become one of these beautiful beings. While this particular individual took his time to prepare before jumping into another life, I've also had clients who seem to have a much more compressed or expedited transition where they consciously and willfully got to the end of their incarnation and then simply moved on to the next one without so much as skipping a beat. A different client described a life on another alien world where he incarnated along an entire group of beings that together constituted a single collective consciousness. He found himself in a humid jungle surrounded by beautiful, lush greenery with massive vines growing all over the place. When I asked him to describe his body, the client was surprised to find that he had webbed hands and feet, which looked amphibian or reptilian. He was a humanoid-looking male with greenish skin and no hair. The eyes were quite large and farther apart than ours, and his face was considerably broader than that of an average human. Reproduction of this species was sexual in nature. The client described some sort of a cloth covering his lower body, and he was also carrying a case containing an object. He later elaborated that his tribe of souls traveled together through lives by using a special gadget, which was utilized to transport them from life to life through different dimensions and realities. So the object he was carrying with him was his personal interdimensional device, and each member of the group had to make their own. As individual aspects of the whole, they had the ability to choose when they arrived and left these pre-selected destinations, and did so at different intervals. This meant that they didn't all come and leave collectively at the same time. Once each person was finished with their personal mission and was therefore ready to depart that life, they would instantly incarnate into the next reality, which the entire group had agreed upon in advance. This was accomplished by holding their special instrument and focusing on the vibration of the next destination. When my client found himself in this alien jungle, he was getting ready to move into his current human existence, and he was the last of his tribe to make the transition. He said that all he had to do was hold a vision of Earth in his mind, and he'd be instantly transported there. The device also gave him the ability to shapeshift and change form that would be appropriate for the particular reality he was traveling to. So according to this particular account, there was no transitional period post-disembodiment where the being would go back to some sort of an in-between place for a life review and debriefing with guides. In fact, there was no disembodiment per se, but rather an instantaneous shifting into another form. Based on the client's description, it sounded like the reality he was describing was of a different level, or outside of the standard incarnational system, if you will. Almost like a different model of an afterlife environment, where the individuated aspects of the soul have the awareness and freedom necessary to make decisions amongst themselves without interference or input from senior guides. It looked like these beings operated from a much higher level of evolutionary development than that of an average human. The client stated that the reason his tribe had to keep moving from life to life is that if they stopped constantly shifting, the aspects would merge together as one consciousness or become reabsorbed into the collective, losing their individual identities. He said, "We stay separate so that we can keep each other company. Otherwise, we would be one person." When I asked the client what surprised him the most about his new life on Earth, he replied with great sadness, "People here don't travel like we do." As you can see from the experiences I shared, is that while there are many similarities in how various people experience the transition from life to death and what follows afterwards, there's also a great deal of variation. But it's like that in our regular human lives. Yes, we are all born and grow from a baby into adulthood, ultimately culminating in death, but no one has the same exact kind of experience. So why would we expect identical afterlives? I had my own experience of crossing over via a spontaneous out-of-body episode during a daytime nap. I couldn't say that this was a transition after a past life or another existence altogether, because I still very much identified as myself. Could this have been a preview of my future transition, which I might go through once I'm done here? I cannot give you a definitive answer. Maybe this was the death of one of my probable selves, which would be an alternate version of my current incarnation. I'm going to talk about the probable selves a bit later, but for now, let me tell you about this interesting incident. I found myself at a river that many people were crossing. It had an unusual shape in that it was really wide at one end and quite narrow at the other. You could cross the wide part by boat and the narrow part on foot. Some people looked like they were in a hurry to get to the other side, but I felt no rush whatsoever. Since all the boats were taken, I decided to cross at the wide end by hopping over the rocks that were sticking out of the water. At one point, I slipped and fully expected to fall into the river, but I didn't, because as my foot landed on the surface, I found it to be solid. This surprised me and made me think of Jesus walking on water. Somewhat amused by this comparison, I kept moving thinking that, wow, this is pretty neat. Once I got to the other side, I found myself in a large room full of people. I simply knew that we were the new arrivals. Amongst the crowd, there were counselors who were checking in with the folks, asking us if we were okay and how we were doing. Some people looked confused and even scared, while others were patiently awaiting further instructions. The next thing I recall was that I had to watch a movie, the idea of which made me nervous and uncomfortable. This was my life review. In this experience, I didn't retain the memory of what I had watched, almost as if it were intentionally erased, which of course would make sense if I was looking into a probable future transition that is to follow after my life here. I imagine it would be counterproductive to view the life I haven't lived yet. The only thing I do remember was that, as afraid as I was to watch it, once it was done and over with, I felt relief and gratitude. The movie explained my life and present circumstances, and I was glad to have watched it. Once the movie part was done, I was taken into a glass office where I saw a man casually dressed in khakis and a white shirt waiting for me with my file. I instantly knew that he was my guide. As he studied my records, he was quite pleased that I accomplished 95% of my program, saying that if I did well, then he did well, because it was a joint effort. But despite the guide's approval, I felt deeply disappointed about the 5%, thinking that I should and could have done better. My next stop was in a different large room, which also looked like office space, with gray wall-to-wall carpet and multiple cubicles, where many people were working and interviewing others like myself. I found myself sitting in front of a very regular-looking middle-aged woman who was casually and very matter-of-factly doing my intake. As I kept talking to her, memories were slowly coming back to me until all of a sudden, a shocking realization hit me. The woman in front of me was a very dear friend who's been with me through many lifetimes, and she had volunteered to be my guide in this incarnation out of her unconditional love for me. I became overcome with such deep emotion that tears started running down my face. And once she saw that I finally remembered, she dropped the act and we both began crying and hugging. Unfortunately, as a result of such a strong emotional outpouring, I got snapped right back into my body. If you have experience with out-of-body travel, then you know that any strong feeling pulls you right back in. It's very hard to stay in a projected state and maintain lucidity unless you can maintain emotional equilibrium at the same time. Afterwards, as I pondered the experience, I understood that the whole reintegration process was designed to be as long or as short as it took for each individual to recall who they were and what they were doing in that place. We weren't told upon arrival that, by the way, you're dead and this is the afterlife. No, it was up to each person to recognize what was happening at their own pace. All these steps of debriefing and evaluation weren't some mandatory bureaucratic requirements, but they were put in place as aids to help us trigger remembrance. Some people needed more time and a longer process, while others went through fewer steps. It was my sense that I came around fairly quickly. The setup was also deliberately designed to be familiar and easily relatable. I imagined that if I were coming out of a life in the Middle Ages, the environment I would encounter afterwards would resemble that era instead of the modern office space. So it appears that how any individual person experiences the end of their life, the period in between and the following rebirth, depends greatly on the type of reality they're coming out of, which of course serves as their base point of reference. Level of lucidity at the time of death, meaning how much awareness people have about the fact that they've transitioned, determines what comes next. This is based on how experienced each person is as an incarnating soul. If you are an old soul, in a manner of speaking, who has had tens of thousands of lives and deaths within this particular reality, then you probably have a pretty good handle on the process and know the drill. You can see how this would make your transition very quick and smooth as opposed to someone who hasn't done this many times and may be disoriented or even unaware that they're no longer in a physical body or that they have departed the density of the physical dimension. If you read books or listen to people's accounts, incarnation and death are usually framed in linear terms. You, meaning the soul, choose a life to learn lessons. You live it, you die, and you then return to the other side where you take some time to regroup and decide on the next life. When that's finished, you jump back into the physical reality for your next incarnation. Sort of like lather, rinse, and repeat. At least that's how most people describe their past life recall. But the reason for this is simply conditioning, because we observe these experiences from the linear point of reference, which is how our present reality is structured. It doesn't mean, however, that this is empirically true and that this is how things work universally. Of course, then you could ask specifically which universe are we talking about, taking us even deeper into the woods. The important point I'd like to reiterate is that in the quantum field, all lives are concurrent. That is, they're happening simultaneously. They're separated by energetic frequency, like a radio channel. When we tune into a specific channel, we have the experience of living the life that's programmed for that specific frequency. Of course, all the other channels are broadcasting their own programming at the same time. So when we jump from channel to channel, as we do during a regression under hypnosis, we interpret these quantum leaps from our native point of view. Part of our physically oriented nature is that the brain likes to create continuity by filling in the blanks. As linearly oriented species, we're simply more comfortable with having a beginning, middle, and end. And so we structure and organize perceived data along those lines. To help you better understand how this works, I'd like to introduce you to the concept of macro and micro levels of reality. Micro-level reality is a type of an artificially closed system. And I say artificially because no system is truly closed that is set up within a larger framework. The larger framework in this context would be the macro reality. A microsystem is designed to be self-contained to preserve a certain purity of experience by imposing strictly defined parameters within a controlled environment. What does this mean? Let's take our physical reality and consider the unique laws of physics that define it. It has a linear time structure tied to three-dimensional space and a relatively dense, rigid composition. So our system is a type of micro-reality. Of course, there are even more levels to this. For instance, we could narrow the criteria even further to a specific era, say 2000 BC. If we view physical reality as a spectrum, then to us, this arbitrarily chosen timeline would represent a subsystem within the physical micro-reality, which would be separate from the subsystem that defines our current era. To create some contrast, let's consider a non-physical, non-linear type of micro-reality that isn't restricted by time, space, or gravity, and which abides by a completely different set of rules. This system would serve as an entirely different incarnational platform, designed to help beings learn lessons that can only be explored from that expanded point of view. If you recall my client's reptilian life, where he traveled with a tribe of souls with the help of a special device, then you will have another example of a specifically calibrated micro-reality. Every microsystem is uniquely tailored to provide a customized environment that is conducive to consciousness development along very specific lines. In such micro-realities, optimal conditions are maintained in order to achieve certain goals. So while the microsystem has little room for variation due to its intentionally rigid structure, the macro or big picture reality isn't bound by any such limitations and can, by definition, contain countless numbers of microsystems of endless variety. You could say that all the different subsystems, including the afterlife, are like model worlds that operate according to their own unique specifications. In a sense, these realities are like artificially designed enclosures, much like a zoo or a fish tank. As already mentioned, the physical plane that you and I share has a very rigid structure and is bound by many restrictions by design. For instance, very few of us have any memory of ourselves as souls and where we came from prior to incarnating. In fact, most of us remain largely unaware of our spiritual heritage and our energetic aspects. This, of course, is intentional to help achieve a very focused and immersive experience for the soul. But there are other realities where these limitations don't apply, which means that the beings who inhabit them are a lot more aware of their true nature and thus have greater creative control over their lives. Just like the reptilian being who retained memories of his other incarnations and was consciously aware of moving from one to the next. I'd like to emphasize again that all of us have concurrent existences in other realities. Remember, You are the soul and not the two-dimensional cartoon character projected onto the artificial medium of physical reality. And as the soul, you contain countless aspects, living out existences in a variety of worlds, densities, and dimensions. How each of these distinct aspects experiences the transition from birth to death and subsequent reincarnation depends on the perspective relative to which any individual self observes that event. For example, a human aspect of the soul will go through a different death process than an extraterrestrial self or an energy essence being. What I'm saying is that there isn't a standard one-size-fits-all protocol for transitioning from what we call life into death, because our reality isn't the only kind of reality that exists within the infinite fabric of creation. And each distinct microsystem is going to be governed by its own rules and protocols that are unique to its particular structure and makeup. All right, I think that I'm going to cut it off right here before your eyes glaze over. I don't want to make the video run too long. What I'll do is I'll break it up into two parts, and we'll pick the discussion up with out-of-body travel and what astral projection teaches us about existence beyond the physical body. So keep an eye out for part 2 of this video. And if you subscribe to my channel, you'll be notified when the conclusion of our discussion on death is posted.